Persecution's not something any of us want. You know, it's not something to be desired. But at the same time, as Colin read there earlier, Jesus said in Matthew 5, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now there's a key word in there. The key word is righteousness. It doesn't mean, you know, if you're persecuted because people don't like your race or something, that has nothing to do with this. But righteous people are going to be persecuted. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. And then the key word in that verse is falsely. You know, if it's true, then, you know, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So people who are righteous, who live right, who live according to God's rules and God's law and God's love, are going to be hated and persecuted by other people. And it's a sad thing, but it's what it is. And this particular verses come from the Beatitudes, which is part of the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus said a lot of things on the Sermon on the Mount that we're still trying to figure out sometimes, because we try to make things complicated. Now I wanted to kind of start from the early church on up to now and kind of just briefly cover things that have happened. And there's no way I can cover it all. You know, I was reading Fox's Book of Martyrs the other day, which is where some of this information comes from. And, you know, it's this thick. And it's all about Christians being persecuted. That's what it's about. Mainly the ones that were killed for the faith. Mainly the martyrs. So there's plenty of references in the New Testament to persecutions that was wrote about by the apostles and how persecutions happened throughout the history of the church. And unfortunately and sadly and shamefully, people who claim to be the church did some of those. So what's persecution? Merriam-Webster defines it this way: the act or practice of persecuting, especially those who differ in origin, religion, or social outlook, and two, the condition of being persecuted, harassed, or annoyed. Now, luckily, for most Christians in the United States, most persecution we've had to endure so far has been under the harassed and annoyed part. You know, they've took some people's money though, and I think that's getting a little more serious. In extreme cases, in other places, we all remember just a couple of years ago over in Syria how ISIS was burning people and crucifying them and just going in and killing whole villages and picking on killing children. Just some really terrible things. A lot of them, they hated everybody apparently, but they hated Christians especially. So a lot of groups are persecuted. It's not just us. In China right now, there's a group of people that are Muslims who are extremely persecuted. I can't ever pronounce their name, Uyghurs or something like that, but you know the ones I'm talking about. But Christians seem to be especially picked on through the years. It seems to be a special thing that they suffer. During the time of the apostles, all of them suffered persecutions. All but John were martyred in various ways. We don't know exactly how some of them did, but we know that there's traditions of what happened to them. You know, for instance, Andrew, you know, that's what they named St. Andrew's cross for, because he was crucified in a cross shape. John is the only one who didn't die an unnatural death, and he was persecuted too. In fact, there's one story, it's not in the Bible, so I can't swear that it's true, but there is one story that keeps going around that John was dipped in boiling oil at one time and survived that. We don't know how much it hurt him or if it hurt him at all, but we do know he was imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos. He was persecuted, and there was mines there that the prisoners were forced to work in the mines. So when John was writing Revelation, he was imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos. He wasn't just there on vacation, he was imprisoned there. And prisoners at that time were either held in holes in the ground or they were forced to work, starved and tortured and things like that. Peter wrote about it. He said, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you." 1 Peter 4:12. He wasn't talking about some spiritual trial that comes on you in the middle of the night, you know. When he said fiery trial, he was talking about people that were actually burned. You know, people that were killed. It's happened through the entire Christian history. And the main reason, I think, for it is people don't like to be reminded of their sin, and that's what Christians do. That's what we do, you know. But all but John died for their faith, and so did hundreds of thousands of others over the years. But the interesting thing about what happened with the apostles and what has happened since is the church grew. The gospel kept spreading, and there's even tales of people that were going to execute Christians that actually became converted themselves during the process. It's a pretty wonderful thing. You know, there was one story I read where this guy was guarding the prisoners while they were to be executed. He accepted Christ, and they turned around and executed him too. He was one of the guards. That was during the Roman Empire. The book of Acts tells about the martyrdom of Stephen. He was the first Christian who was actually killed for the faith. But there was many, many more after that. And if you read Paul's writings, which is a large part of the New Testament, there's lots in there about Paul himself being persecuted. He was not killed initially. He was finally killed. But he was stoned, run out of town, shipwrecked, beat, dragged before the magistrates. He was run out of town. His friends were attacked. He did all this for the gospel, and yet the gospel kept spreading. During the time of Nero, the Roman Emperor Nero, Nero's an interesting character. He was one of the worst people I've ever read about, and there were some pretty bad ones. But the city of Rome had all these big public buildings in the center, kind of like it do now. And then on the outskirts and in suburbs was all a bunch of shanties that most common people lived in. Well, Nero got the bright idea he wanted to make Rome look really beautiful. He had all these buildings he had planned to build, but all these other things were in the way. So him and his cronies went out and set fire to it and burned the whole city of Rome down. And then, when rumors started going around it was him, he started blaming the Christians for it. And of course, the Christians were killed by the hundreds then, thousands probably. In the Colosseum with these beasts, there were numerous times that was happened. They were thrown into the Colosseum with wild lions and tigers and elephants and things like that. And so Nero had a clean ground to build his own buildings on. There's even a story that he had a garden party and he lit it by burning people on crosses. It sounds pretty horrible, don't it? It was horrible. So the church grew, though, even during the most heinous things that happened. Some of the Roman emperors were less or more tolerant than others. Some were less tolerant. Some tolerated Christians altogether, and the church was pretty free. And others severely persecuted them. There was 10 different general persecutions during the Roman period. There were times when that didn't happen. But during when there weren't general persecutions, a lot of times there was local persecutions going on, because if a local official didn't like you, he'd come down on you without asking the central government. That still happens today too. You look at different states and different counties and different cities, and that happens. But you know, God worked these things out. In 306, the Roman emperor, a guy named Constantine, became the Roman emperor, and at first, he kind of tolerated Christians, and then there's stories about what happened. They said that he was one day he had a dream, and he looked there was a cloud up above him, and in the cloud was a cross, and an angel visited him and told him to put the cross in front of his army, and he would always win. So it was kind of a secular spiritual thing, I guess. But anyway, he did that, and then he became a believer himself later on. And a lot of the buildings and churches that were built in the Holy Land that are still there, or the foundations of them that were built on, were built by his mother and his sister. So Constantine had a lot of influence over the Roman Empire and over what happened with Christians. And after that, there was 1,000 years of general peace. When I say general peace, I mean there wasn't no big governmental persecutions, even though there was a lot of smaller ones going on. But the most shameful things occurred during the papal persecutions from 1208 to 1834. For over 500 years, true Christians were persecuted by the church, or people who call themselves the church. I don't think they truly were the church. But these popes, over a period of time, these popes became, it's hard for us to visualize that now, but the Pope was kind of like the king of the world. You know, there was a lot of kings and governments out there, but whenever the Pope spoke, things happened. He had more influence than anyone. The Inquisition, which was a court of clerics, church people. The Inquisition came to Europe during that time and was appointed to persecute heretics. That's people who were against the faith, or said they didn't believe, or did something that offended the Pope or his people. Now, the way the Inquisition worked is, let's say I'm the bishop, local bishop, and I decide David has offended me in some way. I don't like him. I just don't like David. And so me and Colin, we get together, and we maybe pick out one more. We may get Robert to say that David has said something against Christ. He said he don't believe in him. So we bring David up before the court, and David decides if he decides that he's guilty and he confesses, then he gets out really light. We're just going to take all your property and ban you from the town. You know, pretty. But if David decides that he's not guilty and he holds out to not being guilty, we're going to say, okay, well, we're going to torture you until you die. And then, if you don't plead guilty somewhere along the line, we're just going to kill you. And they did that in the most gruesome ways, you know, by burning people with rods and breaking their legs and pulling their skin and cutting off various organs and things like that. So during that time, the true church grew underground. You remember, I know you guys and ladies that are my age or a little older probably remember that in school we were taught about Columbus. You remember Columbus? Do you remember who financed Columbus and sent him over to the New World? It was Ferdinand and Isabella, right? The king and queen of part of Spain. And I remember in the books it'd have a picture of them, and a nice looking, beautiful queen, all in this ermine, and a gorgeous looking young man, you know, with his sword. That was Ferdinand and Isabella. Guess what Ferdinand and Isabella did that the history books don't tell you about much? They appointed this guy named Torquemada as the Grand Inquisitor. And Torquemada personally ordered the burning of 2,000 people at the stake during the Spanish Inquisition, which was the worst of all the Inquisitions. And then it kind of worked its way into mainline Europe and over into England. And this was not the Inquisition, but various political groups would get control of the church. And of course, would take it out on the others. But John Wycliffe lived from 1377 to 1384, was banished for talking about what the Bible really said, you know. Martin Luther reminded the church of what the Bible really said, because common people weren't even allowed to read the Bible. You weren't supposed to read the Bible, you were supposed to listen to your priest. And the village priest, he only knew a half a dozen verses that somebody higher up told him to preach on. He didn't read the Bible either. The only people that read the Bible were church, like scholars. And they knew better than to say anything against the Pope or say anything about it. But John Wycliffe, who dared to translate the Bible, died in his sleep at the age 56. But after he died, a few years after he died, they dug his grave up and burned his body and threw the ashes in the river. That's how much they hated him. Martin Luther managed to live and not get caught up in this, but he was still on the run a lot of times. Several people in England, more than several, were burned at the stake for saying they didn't believe that when you took communion, like we're going to do here in a few minutes, that, you know, when you eat the bread, it turns into the flesh of Christ, and when you drink the blood, it turns into the blood of Christ. That's called I've lost the word. Anyway, it is believing that actually happened, where we know that's a symbolic thing. But just imagine killing somebody for it. But they followed the teachings of John Wycliffe and were burned as a stake. And of course, the church grew then too. Martin Luther, John Firth, William Tyndale, each one of them brought the Bible a little closer to the common people. And when common people read the Bible, things change, because it doesn't support any of this. Tyndale and Firth paid with their lives, and during the next 300 years or so, the number decreased of persecutions once again. But it didn't stop. I mean, that's why the Pilgrims came to America, was to escape persecution. And the Quakers in New England were persecuted, and there was a number of them that were killed. I read about one lady that she refused to give up her faith, so they tied her to a chair, and this was a fairly common punishment that was called dunking, and they did it to women more than they did men. But they put you on the end of a long pole and dumped you in a pond a few times. Well, they dunked her till it killed her, you know. But if you go fast forward to modern days, there's plenty of persecution that went on from the 30s to the 60s, and even on into modern times. Christians were persecuted in the Soviet Union, China, Germany, Korea, and the Middle East. You know, we read about all the Jews that were killed during World War II by Hitler's Germany, but also a lot of preachers and priests were killed then too in Europe. Today, the worst place to be a Christian is probably North Korea, possibly the Middle East, and China's working its way up the ladder. This ISIS group has been decimated under the Trump administration, but I'm thinking they're going to grow back. So you ask, why does the world hate Christians? After all, Christians want a better world for everybody. We do. We want everybody to live a better life. They hate us, number one, because of ignorance. John 16:3. And they will do these things because they have not known the Father nor me. They hate us because they hate God and they hate Christ. John 15:20. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. And they hate the gospel. Matthew 13:21. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. Also because of pride. Psalm 10:2. In arrogance the wicked hotly pursue the poor. They persecuted, tortured, and killed Jesus Christ. Why would we be any better? You know, it said He's the master. Why would it be any better for us? We're enjoying a season of peace right now. But it's already started. You know, it started with these Christian bakers who were persecuted because they wouldn't perform or build cakes for homosexual marriages. The leftist Biden administration that's in power right now has already started. And don't forget, there's a group out there right now on the left that sees the huge income, the huge tax income they could get from taxing churches. If you tax churches and charity groups, they would be billions of dollars roll in. If you cut off if you cut off any tax advantage to charitable donations, billions of dollars would roll in. And they need this money because they're going to be spending it faster than they can print it. Biden, his administration just said they're codifying abortion. Now, what does that mean? Well, up to now, abortion has been a right in this country because of a court decision. But when they codify it, they're actually going to put it into law that abortion is lawful. It's not going to be just a court decision, it's going to be a law, which means it's even harder to oppose. And we know that there's been a lot of talk of adding liberal justices to the Supreme Court. You know, they could add 3 or 4 more justices and gain control of the court. The Equal Rights Amendment, y'all may not remember it. It's been around for a long time, but it's been passed by the House already. If it's passed by the Senate and signed by the President, we are going to have things like churches forced to take on members that are known to be still sinning, transgenders, homosexuals, people like that. This already happened in a couple of colleges where Christian clubs were ordered to have leaders that weren't even Christians. Luckily, that was kicked out, I think, by the Supreme Court. But it's going to get to the point where pastors are going to be persecuted and arrested for saying anything about transgenderism, homosexuality, all those sins in the pulpit. It's already happening in Canada. You don't hear much about it, but it's been happening for a while in Canada. But we've enjoyed this brief respite that we had for the last 4 years, but it's gone now. And I know God uses everything for good. I don't want to paint a big picture of doom and gloom here. Y'all already know this. But God does use everything for good. But America's always been a place where free speech is celebrated. That's why, it all made us mad, but that's why you can burn the flag if you want to. It's free speech, But now, social media companies are saying you can't have free speech. And in some ways, they've become the de facto government. Now we're living in a world that's run by Twitter, Facebook, and Amazon, and YouTube, and a few other places. And we all need these things, and they know we need them. Our world has gotten to where it revolves around this social media, and it's necessary for business and a lot of other things. So now that I've painted all this big mud pit for you, how do we respond? What do we do about it? That's a sermon's not much if you don't tell people what they can do about something. But the number one thing is to pray, because prayer's always been shown to have power. In fact, the Bible says that the power of a righteous man can change things. It does. And follow the Bible. Follow what the Bible says. Live a holy life. We could all live a little bit of holier life, I think. We could. Be a good example to people. Treat your neighbors like yourself. And the church will grow, I think, if we do those things. Go to church. Give. Y'all already do that. Keep doing it. Give of yourself. Support pro-life organizations. The pro-life movement's not giving up because of this. We're just doubling down for our harder battle. We're not giving up. We're not giving up anything. Just making free abortions a law is not going to make it right. You know, this election, just because it happened and just because it put these people in office doesn't make it legitimate. It is still a fraud. It's a fraud, and I think that they're going to reap what they sow. Support Christians running for office. This young man, Madison Cawthorn's been a good example for everybody. And Mark Meadows, you know, he's a local man. He worked closely with President Trump and done a lot of good in the world while they were there. So don't quit, you know. You remember during our 1st and 2nd Samuel study when King David was run out of Jerusalem by his own son and he had to flee for his life? Well, he didn't just go somewhere and sit down and start weeping. He started almost immediately organizing what he was going to do, and then eventually he was king again because he didn't give up. He cried out to God and he fought. Don't quit. Churchill, during World War II, everything was really bad, you know. In London, they were rushing to bomb shelters every few hours while waves of Hitler's bombers and his drones brought rockets down on London, burning buildings and killing people. And Winston Churchill said, "We will never give in. We'll never, 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 never give in." And that's what we are as Christians. We're never going to give in. Don't do it. Never have. We faced a lot of things worse than this, and we're never going to give in. But you need to be an example, and Jesus said we need to pray for our enemies too. So don't be hating people. Just pray for them, and don't agree with them. God hates sin, but He loves people. You know, if you look around, you go to the grocery store and you look around, you need to realize that He loves them all. You know, guy may have a big earring, you know, girl may have a dress up to her waist. They may be drunk, on drugs, whatever, but God loves all of them. So if you go by history, all this stuff's going on may bring a great revival to the churches in America, which we desperately need, because the church is kind of dying out in America. It's not dying out in other places. It's just dying out here. So do we want persecution? No, Lisa, we don't. But it's coming. We need to listen to Christ. In chapter 5, he said, Matthew chapter 5, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For He makes His sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." So what Jesus is saying here is we can't just be an exclusive little club. We have to be friendly to people outside the church too, and deal with them, and be kind to them, and pray for them, but not agree with them. We don't have to agree with them. In fact, we've got to fight against some of the stuff they're doing. And we need to teach our grandchildren, our children, you know, these same things, because it's going away. And we certainly shouldn't lie down and quit. And when somebody comes out with something that is opposed to God's order of things, then we got to resist it, just like Peter and Paul and them did in the book of Acts. And we need to constantly remind ourselves, who runs the world? Who runs the world? God used to run it, but now many say He's dead. So who runs it? Some claim a communist to run the world. And they seem to have a timetable and they appear to be on schedule. Apprehensive souls remind us of their cunningness and cruelty in Afghanistan, Europe, the Middle East, South America, Central America, the United States, and Vietnam. Some whites are sure that the blacks are calling the shots. They're telling Whitey what he must do in government, housing, and unemployment. Still others accuse the Jews of tilting foreign policy of the United States, especially where Israel's concerned. So who runs the world? Politicians, blacks, labor unions, students, environmentalists, the Pentagon? Who runs the world? Does President Biden run the world? Be not deceived, God is in control. In the world you have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. That's what he said. We need to believe him. If you guys come up, we'll do communion.